Clarity Clinical Solutions.
What does it cost to develop a brand new drug? The number you often hear is $2.6 billion. But that number sounds almost unbelievable. How can a single medicine cost that much? And more importantly, where does all that money go? Today we're going to break down the real cost of bringing a new drug to the pharmacy shelf. First, let's be clear about what the $2.6 billion actually covers. It doesn't mean a company spends that much on one clinical trial. It includes everything: the cost of every failed drug, every abandoned experiment, every clinical trial that didn't work out. Think of it like building a skyscraper. You're not just paying for the final tower. You're paying for every blueprint that got thrown away, every foundation that cracked, and every redesign along the way. The one success has to pay for all the failures that came before it. The total cost breaks down into three main categories. First, preclinical research, that's the discovery, screening, and animal testing. This accounts for roughly $500 million to $1 billion. Second, clinical trials, testing in humans across phase 1, 2, and 3. This is the biggest chunk at $1 to $1.5 billion. And third, manufacturing, scaling up production, quality control, and packaging. That's around $100 to $500 million. Clinical trials alone eat up about half of the total budget. Why is the failure cost so high? Because the drug development pipeline is a brutal funnel. For every one drug that gets approved, researchers might screen 5,000 to 10,000 compounds in the early stages. About 250 of those make it to preclinical testing. Only 5 enter human trials. And maybe 1 or 2 complete phase 3 successfully. Every one of those failures cost real money. The drugs that fail in phase 2 still needed years of research, hundreds of patients, and millions of dollars. And that cost gets folded into the price of the one drug that succeeds. So where does the money actually go? Clinical trials consume the largest share at about 50% of total development costs. Preclinical research and development takes about 30%. Manufacturing is roughly 12%. And regulatory fees and compliance eat up the remaining 8%. The biggest single expense is phase 3 clinical trials, which can cost $100 to $300 million all by themselves. That's because phase 3 requires thousands of patients, dozens of hospital sites around the world, and years of data collection. Let's look at each clinical phase in more detail. Phase 1 focuses on safety with 20 to 80 healthy volunteers. It typically costs $10 to $25 million. Phase 2 tests efficacy with 100 to 300 patients. That costs $20 to $50 million. Phase 3 is the big one, confirming the drug works in 1,000 to 3,000 patients, and costs anywhere from $100 to $300 million. Phase 4 is post-market monitoring, adding another $10 to $50 million. In total, clinical development accounts for the lion's share of that $2.6 billion figure. You might have noticed I said $1 to $2.6 billion. That's a huge range. Why such a big difference? 3 reasons. First, methodology. Some studies count the cost of capital, meaning what that money could have earned if invested elsewhere. Others only count out-of-pocket spending. Second, the therapeutic area matters a lot. Cancer drugs cost 25 to 50% more to develop than antibiotics because the science is harder and the trials are longer. And third, company size. Big pharmaceutical companies include all their overhead and failed programs, while small biotechs report lower costs but take bigger risks. Let's talk about the elephant in the room. About 90% of drugs that enter human trials never get approved. 9 out of 10 fail. The most common failure point is phase 2, where a drug that looked promising in early testing simply doesn't work as expected in patients. Some drugs fail in preclinical testing when safety issues appear in animal studies. And the most painful failures happen in phase 3, after hundreds of millions have already been spent. But these failures aren't wasted, they teach researchers what doesn't work, which is just as valuable as knowing what does. Several factors are driving development costs even higher over time. First, we're tackling more complex diseases, cancer, Alzheimer's, rare genetic conditions. These are harder problems that require more sophisticated science and longer trials. Second, regulatory requirements keep increasing. Agencies demand more data, more safety monitoring, and more patient diversity. Third, patient recruitment is getting harder. Many trials struggle to enroll on time, which adds months or years of delay. And fourth, the cost of capital, because drug development takes 10 to 15 years, the time value of money alone adds billions to the headline figure. But here's the important question, is the cost worth it? A $2.6 billion drug that cures hepatitis C actually saves the healthcare system far more than it costs. Patients avoid decades of treatment, hospitalizations, and liver transplants. But a $100 million drug for a condition almost nobody has just isn't worth developing. That's why drug pricing debates are so complicated. You're not just paying for the pill in your hand. You're paying for all the research that made it possible, and for the next drug that hasn't been discovered yet. So how can we bring these costs down? For promising approaches. First, artificial intelligence and machine learning can screen millions of compounds in a computer, predict which ones will be toxic, and design better trials from the start. Second, adaptive trial designs allow researchers to make changes mid-study based on emerging data. Third, using biomarkers to select the right patients means smaller, faster trials with higher success rates. And fourth, open collaboration between pharmaceutical companies means they share data on failed drugs so nobody repeats the same mistakes. The industry is slowly moving from secrecy toward transparency. These costs affect real people every day. High development costs mean high drug prices, which means some patients simply cannot afford their medications. The average 10 to 15-year timeline from discovery to pharmacy shelf means patients wait a long time for new treatments. And for rare diseases, the situation is even harder. Because the patient population is small, the cost per patient to develop a treatment is extremely high. That's why governments offer special incentives and market exclusivity for orphan drugs. Without those incentives, many rare disease drugs would never be developed at all. Looking ahead, there are reasons for optimism. AI-powered tools like AlphaFold are already cutting years off the discovery process. Decentralized clinical trials that use telemedicine and wearable devices reduce site costs and make it easier for patients to participate. Real-world evidence from electronic health records can supplement traditional trial data. And platform trials that test multiple drugs at once against a common control group are more efficient than running separate trials. But challenges remain. Regulatory complexity continues to grow, manufacturing biologics and gene therapies is expensive, and public pressure on drug pricing won't go away. So let's recap what we learned. Developing one new drug costs between $1 and $2.6 billion on average. About 90% of drugs fail during development, and the cost of those failures is built into the price of the one that succeeds. Clinical trials consume the largest share of the budget. The whole process takes 10 to 15 years. And new technologies like AI are beginning to bring these costs down. The next time you see a surprisingly expensive medication, remember, you're not just paying for a bottle of pills. You're paying for a decade of science, thousands of failures, and the hope that the next breakthrough is just around the corner.